Good morning, everyone. We'll look to start the webinar now. So welcome to this morning's webinar, Managing an ArcGIS Enterprise Install. So this webinar is part of a free series hosted by Eagle Technology, the official Esri distributor for New Zealand and the South Pacific. This series will be continuing in 2023, and we look into topics coming up such as publishing to the web and using ArcGIS Online and ArcGIS Enterprise, ArcGIS for Health, exploring ready-to-use content for ArcGIS for New Zealand, and what's new in local maps. So today, you've got myself, Andrew, and I'll quickly turn on my webcam here. How are we all going? So yeah, I'm Andrew. I'm in the GIS support team, technical support consultant, and based down in Invercargill. And I'll let Tom, who's also on the line, introduce himself.
Morena, I'm Thomas Ayley, part of the GIS Managed Services team here at Eagle. As part of my role, I've done a number of ArcGIS Enterprise and cloud infrastructure deployments using a variety of ArcGIS Enterprise versions and different deployment methods, and on both Azure and AWS cloud infrastructure, as well as private data center hardware. So that's kind of my background and where I'm going to be coming from in this webinar.
Awesome, thanks, Tom. So today's topics we'll head through. So today we're going to look at managing an install. So we'll look at installation prerequisites. What do we need when we're looking to deploy a enterprise environment? The architecture behind that deployment, the different ways we can install. There's multiple ways that we can install ArcGIS Enterprise. We look at ArcGIS Enterprise Base deployment. That's a minimum requirement for Enterprise. And the different ArcGIS server roles, including data stores as well. And then just some things with post-installation, things to consider. And then we'll round out with looking at some resources. So there's some fantastic resources on the web that you can look at, and then have a live Q&A as well. So on that, in terms of asking questions, so you should have on the right-hand side panel a wee text box there. So throughout this webinar, feel free to ask any questions, and we'll try and answer them at the end. So yeah. Cool. Great. So we'll jump straight into it. So managing an ArcGIS install. So the installation and prerequisites. So these are things to consider when installing any enterprise environment. So obviously we've got the architecture, and really the architecture is a fundamental and a massive consideration on how you're going to deploy your enterprise. So Tom's going to go into more detail with architecture later on in the webinar, but essentially there's different ways that we can deploy. So whether it's looking at a single machine deployment or looking at a multi-machine deployment, and the hardware that you'll need for these, depending on what you choose. And obviously then software, we move to software. So what software do we need for a base deployment? But we also might want to look at some additional, for example, like notebook server or image server, and how does that look? Do we have that sufficient software that we need flowing into that, as well as licensing? So Do we have the correct licensing files for the software we're going to install? We can get the licensing from My Esri. So in your organizations, you can go into your My Esri and install or download the licensing from there as well. Certificates is another one that you need to consider. So as part of the process with installing ArcGIS Enterprise, it uses self-signed certificates. So it is actually best practice that once you've installed Enterprise, is then to replace those self-signed certificates with CA signed certificates. As well, looking at accounts. So do we have the system administrator accounts that we need with the sufficient privileges to install ArcGIS Enterprise? And lastly, another thing to consider is the firewall. So do you have the correct ports open to allow for communication between machines, for example, in a multi-machine deployment? There is some fantastic documentation that Esri has on all of this stuff here. So I do recommend going and checking that out. And we'll show you the links at the end of this webinar as well. So I think from here, I'll hand over to Tom to talk a bit more about the architecture.
Awesome. Tom. Thanks, Andrew. So just to caveat all of what I'm about to say, I am not an architect. However, as Andrew has said, architecture is fundamental, and it's important to identify all of your workflows before you start the installation so you can deploy an appropriate system on adequately sized hardware. While ArcGIS Enterprise is flexible and can deal with extra components being added later on, often the hardest part is getting approval from the higher ups for the additional costs, the disruption in work, and any sort of interruptions and sort of long-term planning required for your upgrades. So the single machine deployment is, as it suggests, it's a simple all-in-one deployment. You've got your web adapter, portal, hosting server, and data store all on one machine. These are really good for sort of smaller non-production systems that don't need a lot of capacity to deal with high demand. However, this approach can cause some resource contention, as obviously all of your ArcGIS components have to share disk and CPU and memory. Sort of the more common approach, more robust approach, but also more complicated deployment is the distributed deployment. So these deployments can be expanded with multiple ArcGIS server roles, and each ArcGIS server site can be made of multiple underlying servers. It's highly customizable depending on you and your users' needs. And this approach can also scale to target resources as needed and can be flexible to include a variety of specialized ArcGIS server roles and different sort of data stores depending on your need. We'll go into those a little bit later. Quite often, what we will do in managed services is a hybrid approach with a single ArcGIS portal, server, and data store with a separate web adapter just to sort of limit the security exposure, and then additional ArcGIS servers federated in. The HA, or high availability deployment, has multiple instances of ArcGIS component. The idea to increase redundancy and reduce downtime should there be an issue with any of your individual components. There's the second component there that it can leverage and still return requests. Machine sizing for ArcGIS Enterprise is definitely a dark art. I try and leave it to experienced GIS architects. It's a bit of a luxury I have working at Eagle, that we have some wonderful GIS architects around to leverage for this kind of thing. But it is one of one of everyone's favorite questions is, how big do my servers really have to be? Are these recommendations for real? The short answer is yep, absolutely. They've done a lot of testing and they've given their recommendations based on that. And I'm definitely not going to stand here and disagree with them. Cloud versus on-prem deployments, in terms of the actual deployment process, there's not a lot to differentiate them. Major considerations when deciding whether you should go for a cloud infrastructure deployment or an on-prem data center is about where your data is going to sit. So if all of your data sits in a database on a server in a data center in Hamilton or something, then having your ArcGIS Enterprise environment and cloud infrastructure based out of Australia, you're going to have performance impacts. But you know, the flip side of that is if you're going to be building a shiny new system from the ground up and you're planning on migrating all your data anyway, then there are some cool cloud native solutions that can be deployed as part of your ArcGIS Enterprise. You can utilize Azure Application Gateways in place of ArcGIS Web Adapters. And you know, there are plenty of database as a service offerings across the different cloud providers that can host your enterprise databases, turning most of your database administration tasks into sort of behind the scenes, hands-off stuff. Realistically, the deployment process is fairly unchanged. Most of the differences are overcome before you click install, and it's about what's most appropriate to your enterprise. So if you have all of your other stuff is on-prem and all of your expertise is on-prem, then trying to sort of do a lift and shift into the cloud all by yourself might be a greater undertaking than necessary. But speaking of installs, yeah, I can't get the next slide to load. Andrew, thank you. Sorry for the technical difficulties. So there are a number of different sort of manual and automated installation methods. It's not just a case of clicking next anymore. I'm a firm believer that sort of as a traditionalist, I think everyone should do a manual install at least once, even if you're just doing a test run on your laptop. It's a great place to get started. It's a good way to get familiar with all the different components, how they all link together, and some of the different configuration options when you're going through the install. If you're not having to do a lot of installs, there's no need to go beyond this. It's a robust method. It'll prompt you to make sure all the prerequisites are met and the configuration settings make sense. There is, as I said, a lot of clicking next, but it won't let you click next if you're trying to install on the D drive and the server only has an E drive. Onto the Enterprise Builder, and I'll hand it back over to Andrew.
Yeah, so if you do want to go next, then you have the option of ArcGIS Enterprise Builder. So it is designed in its most simplest form to get the basic or a base deployment of ArcGIS Enterprise, which we'll touch on further around the details of that. But the key thing here is it's only on a single machine deployment. So if you're going through a multi-machine deployment, then unfortunately ArcGIS Enterprise Builder, you can't use it, it's only on that single machine. And so what it does is ArcGIS Enterprise Builder works in two parts. It installs ArcGIS Enterprise software on your machine. Once that software has been installed, then it opens up a browser window for you to configure the software. And once complete, then you'll have access both to your ArcGIS Enterprise portal and the ArcGIS Server Manager. Back to you, Tom, to talk about the PowerShell.
Oh, thanks, Andrew. So PowerShell is the method we use in managed services. I love it. It's great. I've got a little little image here of the config file that's required for it, or a sample config file that's required for it. It provides a hands-off, repeatable installation and covers some of the post-install configuration of ArcGIS Enterprise deployment as well. There is a little bit of setup required prior to running the script. It's not just a PowerShell and go kind of thing, but once configured, the installation and configuration runs without any intervention. PowerShell will install and configure and license ArcGIS Enterprise, deploying the software and linking the components. And it can also configure some of your security settings for you. The deployment can be configured to download the software and any available patches as well. However, if your machine doesn't have internet access, you can point them to already downloaded files. The PowerShell deployment method requires the ArcGIS PowerShell module to be added to the machines that ArcGIS is going to be installed on, and a JSON config file to specify all the required parameters. All the details of these parameters, the ArcGIS PowerShell module, and some sample configs are all stored on the ArcGIS PowerShell DSC GitHub. It's a really useful repository for deployment automation. And there are also a number of other automation tools available that I haven't had a chance to play with too much and put through their paces. So I'm just going to briefly cover them off. The Chef cookbooks. So if you're familiar with using Chef cookbooks for deployment automation, there is an Esri GitHub dedicated to these. It's similar to the PowerShell DSC GitHub. It includes templates, tutorials to help you get started. There's a cloud builder, which is a similar tool to Enterprise Builder. There's a separate one for both AWS and Azure. Very helpful tool that can also deploy some of your infrastructure, underlying infrastructure, as well as the software. And then the CloudFormation templates. This is a deployment solution for deploying the infrastructure and software specific to the AWS cloud environment. Esri have worked with AWS to provide these and get them published. I have assisted on a build that used these a few years ago, and the only takeaway comment from that was that the templates were too good. They templated a lot of, well, all of the different optional settings. Some of them sort of conflict with each other, so there's no way that you'd need all of those settings to deploy your environment. The result being that this makes the template itself too long to run. So some editing and familiarity with what you're deploying is required. But speaking of deployments, on to Andrew and enterprise-based deployments.
Perfect. So yeah, so once we've gone through and we've identified the architecture that we need for our deployment, and then gone through what installation process we're going to go through our deployment, it's time for us to deploy ArcGIS Enterprise. And what you'll hear a lot of the time in the documentation especially is the term ArcGIS Enterprise Base deployment. And what that means is it's the minimum components to set up for an ArcGIS Enterprise deployment. And it consists of 4 key aspects. So you've got your portal, your server, your data store, and your web adapter. So what does this mean? Well, portal for ArcGIS is essentially how you interact with Enterprise. It has a very similar look and feel to ArcGIS Online, and it's your central hub for creating and managing content, including maps, apps, and spatial data. It's your GUI interface. It's what you can use to configure some of the aspects of Enterprise, but as well as it's what your users are going to use to interact with Enterprise as well. Then you have ArcGIS Server. So ArcGIS Server is a powerhouse behind Enterprise. It does all the heavy lifting when completing analysis. But with ArcGIS Server, it can also be configured to have more capabilities. So you can add in other server roles, for example, like an image server or a notebook server that adds extra functionality to your enterprise. There is a functionality matrix that is a very good resource to look at to see what benefits you have there. And if we have time at the end, we can probably go through and show some of that as well. Then we have the data store. So as the name suggests, it provides data storage for the hosting server. It's where all your feature layer, hosted feature layers are going to be stored. And generally the base one is what's called a relational data store. There are several different types of data stores available as well. Again, each with their own benefit, which Tom will go into further detail further. Then the last component is the web adapter. And the web adapter controls the requests that are made to Enterprise. It's essentially like a traffic manager. It must be installed on a machine that is running a web server. But depending on your architecture, it can be installed on an ArcGIS server, or it can be installed on a separate machine. But the key aspect of it, it needs to be running a web server on that machine. So here's Tom to talk about the different ArcGIS server roles available.
Awesome, thanks Andrew. So as mentioned, there are a variety of different ArcGIS server roles to extend the functionality of your ArcGIS Enterprise. I haven't personally had a lot to do with all of these, and they are thoroughly documented on the Enterprise website. So if you are planning on utilizing one, definitely make sure you check the documentation first. The GIS server is the OG of ArcGIS servers, sometimes also referred to as a general purpose server. Quite often in GIS managed services, we will deploy a federated GIS server alongside the base deployment for the purpose of moving some of that load away from the single machine base deployment. Common workflow is if there's a majority of data coming from databases, we'll separate out these workflows so that only hosted feature services are published to the hosting service and reference services are published to the federated GIS server. The standalone, the GIS server has pretty standard requirements. There's nothing special to consider with it, but the geo event server requirements vary greatly depending on your data streams. Geo event can scale into multi-machine sites pretty nicely and can be connected with a spatial temporal data store for high velocity and large volume archiving. The spatial temporal data store isn't a firm requirement. A relational data store can handle up to about 200 events per second. So again, it depends on the number and volume that you of your data streams. Geo event is also not compatible with the ArcGIS web adapter, so you do need to open extra ports on the firewall. For example, the event manager and REST endpoints use port 6143 for HTTPS traffic. The geoanalytics server has the highest memory requirement of the ArcGIS server roles, and it has got that spatial temporal data store as a firm requirement. The image server, which can be used for both dynamic image services and raster analysis, can optionally utilize the raster ArcGIS data store for image storage, but not a firm requirement there. Notebook server utilizes Docker, and this provides it with an isolated and secure environment for the notebooks. It has more specific OS requirements. Notebook server for ArcGIS 11 is not supported on Windows Server 2016, while the rest of the ArcGIS 11.1 stack is. So if you're upgrading Notebook Server on a machine running Windows 2016, you do need to upgrade the operating system before you can upgrade Notebook Server. Notebook Server also needs port 11443 open. Workflow Server is nice and simple. That's just utilizes port 13443. Knowledge Server, it creates super cool knowledge graphs to explore the relationships between entities and requires the ArcGIS data store graph store. You can store knowledge data in Neo4j NoSQL data stores, but you do still need that graph store in there. In terms of the various different ArcGIS data stores, the big consideration with the different data stores is firewall ports. ArcGIS data store uses port 2443 for the deployment and configuration, but beyond that, there are a myriad of firewall requirements that depend on which data stores and how many you're deploying. Some data stores have special port requirements depending on if they're going to be clustered or just a single machine. As you can see in the image I've included on this slide, it's chaos. There's lots of them. The first two data stores in this list I've seen sit happily alongside each other and on the same machine as an ArcGIS server. Of course, this is very dependent on how heavily you're planning on using them and the resources of the machine hosting them. The relational data store used for hosted feature layers. This data store is a requirement of ArcGIS Enterprise, and we often install it alongside the ArcGIS server machine on the same hardware. The tile cache data store stores your hosted scene layers and caches. Again, no overly special requirements with it. These next data stores where you should consider installing them on standalone machines. They are also a lot more specialized, so you may never need them. The spatiotemporal big data store, aside from being a bit of a mouthful, archives data from GeoEvent Server, stores locations from apps that rely on location sharing, and contains results generated using geoanalytics tools. I did once hear it said that there's no such thing as big data. There's no black and white point at which point the data becomes big data. There's just data that's too big for your system, at which point big data tools become appropriate. I'm not a data architect, so I wouldn't know how accurate that is. I just think it sounds cool and is a cool way of justifying getting some sweet big data tech in there. The graph store is part of the ArcGIS knowledge solution. If you're using knowledge, you need a graph store. It also has the highest minimum memory requirements and some specific CPU requirements. It's the kind of thing that if you're using ArcGIS knowledge, definitely go and check out the documentation. But otherwise, it's sort of by the by. The object store that's also recommended to be installed and configured on a machine with no other data stores on it. It can be configured in a multi-machine cluster, but you can only specify that at creation. You cannot change a single machine object store into a cluster mode after it has been created. Once you've got your nice shiny ArcGIS Enterprise installed, there are a couple of things that you should configure before you get too carried away and start making your pretty maps and lovely apps. Things, to keep your site secure, there are a number of security configuration steps we recommend. These settings are sprinkled throughout ArcGIS Enterprise. There's some in the portal front end, some in the portal and server admin REST APIs, and in the portal sharing API. CORS, or cross-origin resource sharing, I believe it is unrestricted by default. So if you don't configure it, there's no security settings there. In an oversimplified sense, CORS prevents other sites from embedding your services. Proxy hosts setting, that limits your portal's ability to act as a proxy. Along with the CORS settings, sort of in GIS managed services, our out-of-the-box recommendation is to set these to the URL of your portal, and then add more exceptions as needed. Sort of a start with most restricted and slowly open things up as time goes. Your ciphers and TLS settings all come under the umbrella of configuring SSL properly. This helps keep your HTTPS traffic secure. Things like limiting TLS to 1.2 for ensuring compatibility, or enabling TLS 1.3 to get that extra level of security where it's available. Specifying SSL ciphers and your TLS settings is all done via the admin API. A little word of warning here, take it from someone who's learnt this the fun way. Be careful when editing your ciphers and make sure that they are supported by the operating systems running your environment before you click save. As all of these settings are managed through the HTTPS interface, if you restrict it to unsupported ciphers, you then can't get back in and change it easily. There are token timeout settings. Your portal has a number of different tokens that it uses to manage sessions, manage user sessions and application sessions. These are all handled through the portal sharing REST endpoint. As I mentioned, there are a couple of different tokens. There is only one timeout setting. If you set your maximum token timeout to be less than the maximum of one of these tokens, then it reduces that one, but not the other ones. It doesn't increase, can't increase the maximum beyond the software specified maximum. Both the server and portal have got initial administrator accounts. Once connected to the data store and federated with the portal, the server primary site administrator isn't needed and can be disabled. There are certain settings in which you wouldn't do this. Certain software needs access to that, to a server administrator account. ArcGIS Monitor, the new ArcGIS Monitor, for example, uses the server administrator account to access and monitor ArcGIS server. Portal's primary site administrator can only be disabled if you have created another portal administrator account. To make life easier for users, you can configure ArcGIS Enterprise with to leverage your enterprise login credentials. The most common method for this that I come across in GIS managed services is utilizing SAML to authenticate with Active Directory. It's also possible to manage group membership this way too. When you create your group in ArcGIS Enterprise, manually create a group in the portal using the same name as in Active Directory. And then when users log into their group, log into the ArcGIS Enterprise, the group membership is checked and they're either automatically added to, or if need be, removed from those groups. It's important to note that if you are using enterprise logins and SAML authentication, deleting a user in Active Directory does not delete the account in ArcGIS Enterprise. You need to make sure you have got robust onboarding and offboarding processes, otherwise you can end up with orphaned accounts. Member roles, so configuring default member roles can allow you to sort of open up access to the portal a little bit. A common workflow that I see here is that when combined with your SAML logins, your enterprise logins. You can allow users to automatically be created within the portal using your default member role. So this means that you can let all of your organization users automatically log into the portal as a viewer with minimal input from your GIS administrator. But also you can create custom member roles and sort of manage privileges through custom member roles. It's not just the default roles that are provided in ArcGIS Enterprise. It's always worth double checking your log settings, making sure they're appropriate. Quite often by default, logging will be at sort of warning, and that's fine. It'll give you a heads up that something isn't happy. It can make retrospective troubleshooting challenging. The flip side of that is that if you leave your logging at debug, that's a great way of churning through disk space. So in the GIS managed services, we usually look to set the logs around the info level, and it gets a good balance of providing useful information, but also not being an absolute disk hog. A quick shout out to the Eagle team that manage the gorgeous New Zealand base maps. The free NZTM base maps are available in Living Atlas. You can search for them in ArcGIS Enterprise, share them to a base map group, and along with any other internal base maps you might want to include, have these show up in the base map gallery. The Living Atlas itself isn't continuously updated in ArcGIS Enterprise, but those references to the base maps themselves are updated, so you just add them into your portal base map group, and they're there for your users to add to their wonderful maps and apps. So you've had your ArcGIS Enterprise Guide for a couple of years, and you've seen some pretty new features that have been released. So it's time to upgrade your ArcGIS Enterprise. There are a couple of prerequisites. It's always important to make sure that you've got everything ready before you start the upgrade process. Simple things like not having appropriate license or not having a clear picture of the environment you're upgrading can cause massive headaches mid-upgrade. There are less obvious gotchas to watch out for during the upgrade process too. A automatic backup is created of the portal content, which uses about 2.5 times the current space of the content and internal portal database. If you run out of space during the upgrade, it is a bad time. Another key thing to remember is that if you're using enterprise geodatabases, these aren't automatically upgraded with the software, so it needs to be considered when planning your upgrade. It's very important to make sure you have all the credentials you'll need. This includes admin credentials to run the installer, also the username and password of the service accounts that your Esri products are running under, but also it's quite helpful to, if you have disabled that ArcGIS server primary site admin, to undisable that during the upgrade process, just in case there are, to aid with the refederation if needed, or the reconfiguration of the data store. Part of planning your upgrade should always be checking with Esri documentation around what parts of the ArcGIS Enterprise stack have been retired, just so that you know that your users' current data and things aren't going to be destroyed as part of the upgrade, or so that you can make a plan to migrate them and keep everyone happy and everything safe. In terms of the actual upgrade process, there are two main sort of main ways of doing this. Most of the time, you'll probably do an in-place upgrade. I know most of the time we do in-place upgrades. aside from the ArcGIS web adapter, and that needs to be manually uninstalled and reinstalled. And you need to keep the context of that web adapter the same. So for example, if your ArcGIS server is /hosting, you need to uninstall it and then reinstall it as /hosting. But yeah, so aside from the web adapter, the remaining ArcGIS Enterprise components are just a over-the-top upgrade. Do not uninstall anything other than the web adapter before running the upgrade, please. As well as that, the same automation tools can be used that were used to deploy the environment can then be used to upgrade the environment. So in our case, in GIS Managed Services, if you've used PowerShell to deploy the initial ArcGIS upgrade, ArcGIS Enterprise, sorry, you can then use the same config file and just change the version number in it. And I think to be completely accurate, you have to add an extra line that says that you've got an old version and a new version, and then you hit go. And that's nice and easy. It's basically, you change the line, hit go, and it can download the installers, it can download all the latest patches. You can go off and take the dog for a walk and come back, and ArcGIS Enterprise is busy upgrading for you. You don't have to watch progress bars, you don't have to click next, you don't have to apply licenses. All of that stuff gets done for you. There are a number of reasons, however, why an over-the-top upgrade might not be suitable. You might want to reduce downtime, or you might be looking to move to new hardware. You might have, Windows Server 2016, and you need to replace it with Windows Server 2019. Or you might just, be risk averse and you want to limit the potential risk. If the upgrade doesn't go smoothly, you want to make sure that you've got that other environment there so that you can keep the lights going and keep everything going. In that case, you'd be looking at doing a side-by-side upgrade. The most common workflow for this is deploying a whole new ArcGIS Enterprise environment and hardware at the same version. And this is again where your automation tools can come in really handily. So you can, again with the PowerShell automation, you change your machine names, run install, it'll go and install the exact same ArcGIS Enterprise that you've already got there. And then ArcGIS Enterprise has a really cool WebGIS DR tool that will take a backup of all of your content and configuration. Within reason, there are a few caveats there, but oversimplifying it, it will take a backup of all of that, and then you can restore that onto the new site. And so you've got your two ArcGIS Enterprises next to each other, and then you upgrade the new site, and then you can point your DNS or traffic manager or your load balancer or whatever's going on to the upgraded site, and nice and easy, minimal downtime, and it all goes, fingers crossed, all goes nice and smoothly. Just a final plug for Eagle's GIS Managed Services. We do include or can include annual upgrades in the Eagle GIS Managed Services, so you don't have to worry about all of that headache and all of the process. We just come in and upgrade your environment for you, and you get a nice shiny up-to-date ArcGIS Enterprise.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. That's fantastic. But it's a lot to take in over the last 3/4 of an hour that we've talked in. So there's a lot to take in there. So do recommend looking at at some of the documentation. So of course, these are the learning resources. If you've got any questions about anything that either Tom or myself have talked about and you would like to know a little bit more, please ask any questions. Get them coming through. We've got a few more minutes to go through, so get those questions in, and we might just have a look at some of the learning resources that's available. So obviously we've got the blogs page, which is good to see how Enterprise is being used. But we've also got the documentation, which is fantastic, which I will go through that shortly. We've got the developers page as well, so that can be with a bit more technical aspects. So some of those things that Tom was talking about there. There's documentation there, as well as Esri YouTube and the chef cookbooks as well. So I might just show a couple of. So this is the documentation for Enterprise. So we see up here we've got the portal, we've got the servers, data source. So it's breaking down into the different fundamental aspects of Enterprise. We can see easy installation, different topics that we can talk about here. So the essentials. So this is tools and documentation on. So for example, we can have a look at system architecture, and then we can see the best practices on what we need to look for. And Enterprise can be as straightforward as we can, using, if we go through the architecture on that single machine, using the Enterprise Builder, to a lot more complicated deployments. There's also the ArcGIS functionality matrix, and this again is a fantastic resource. It goes through, and so when we're talking about the different server roles or ways of installation, we can see different ways we can install it. Install Enterprise, different server capabilities. So this is a fantastic resource. And if you are planning on looking at an upgrade, or this would probably be a good start. We also have a series of upcoming webinars, so I touched on them previously. So in October, we've got the publishing to the web using ArcGIS Online and ArcGIS Enterprise. And 2nd of November, we've got ArcGIS for Health. 16th of November, exploring ready-to-use content in ArcGIS for New Zealand. 30th of November, what's new in local maps. And check out the Eagle website, eagle.co.nz/learn, to see what other webinars that are coming up. So that might be about it. If we will stick around for a couple of minutes, if there are any questions, but otherwise, yeah, thank you very much for your time today. Tom, do you have anything you want to add at all?
No, I think we smashed it. Obviously, ArcGIS Enterprise installs are there's a lot to go into. So I tried to sort of not get too stuck down in the weeds. But yeah, any specific questions, feel free to send them through. Any non-specific questions as well, I'll happily talk football or motorcycles or anything.
There are details if you've got any, if anything comes up later on that you want to think about asking as well. Oh, well, we might end it there. So again, thank you very much for attending today's webinar.
Thank you.
Sure.